Echoes before the divide of Africa. Before borders were drawn with rulers and ink, Africa existed in rhythm. Kingdoms rose and fell, trade routes breathed life into cities, and cultures spoke in thousands of tongues. But in the winter of 1884, far from African soil, a quiet room in Berlin became louder than drums, louder than wars. 14 foreign powers gathered, not to explore Africa, not to understand our people, but to decide our fate. No African voice was invited, no African hand signed the documents. What followed was not a meeting of peace, but the beginning of an era, where rivers became borders, where communities were split, and where ambition wore the marks of civilization. This is not just a story of map and empires, it is a story of consequences, of decisions made in comfort and suffering endured far away. This is the Berlin Conference, and these are the echoes it left behind. The Berlin Conference, held between 15 November 1884 to 26 February 1885, was a pivotal meeting of European powers aimed at resolving competing imperial interests in Africa. Representatives from 14 nations, including major players like France, Germany, and Great Britain, convened to discuss colonial claims and establish guidelines for the occupation of African territories. Although the conference did not formally partition Africa, it significantly influenced the scramble for Africa, which had already commenced. King Leopold II of Belgium notably emerged as a primary beneficiary, gaining international recognition for his control over the Congo Free State, a territory vast and rich in resources. The conference addressed issues such as freedom of commerce and navigation, with less emphasis on humanitarian concerns despite initial claims. The agreements reached facilitated European expansion into the continent, disregarding the rights and well-being of African peoples. By the early 20th century, most of Africa was under the European control, leaving only Ethiopia, Liberia, and Morocco independent. The legacy of the Berlin Conference is complex, and it not only marked a significant moment in colonial history, but also led to severe exploitation and suffering in Africa, particularly under Leopold's regime in the Congo. The Berlin Conference was organized in the capital of Germany in Berlin, and that is the reason why it is referred to historically as the Berlin Conference. Key figures who participated in this conference were Otto von Bismarck, first German Chancellor, who ruled from 1871 to 1890, Leopold II, King of Belgium, who ruled from 1865 to 1909, although history has it that he was represented. Henry Morton Stanley, a British American newspaper correspondent and explorer who was born in 1841 and died in 1904, was also present. The countries that attended the 1884 to 1885 Berlin Conference were Austria-Hungary, Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, Great Britain, Italy, the Netherlands, Ottoman Empire, Portugal, Russia, Spain, Sweden, Norway, and the United States of America. Before we continue, let us go back to the echoes of time to understand the various activities that conglomerate towards the formation of what became the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 for better clarification. Now, European involvement in sub-Saharan Africa went back hundreds, even thousands of years. The ancient Greeks and Romans had sailed and traded along the continent's eastern shore, particularly with the Axumites, present-day Ethiopia, and Portuguese explorers and merchants had established a presence along the western coast of Africa in the late 15th century, and they began operating along the East African coast during the 16th century. During the mid 17th century, the Dutch founded Cape Town in South Africa and began colonizing the region around it. Intense European colonization, however, did not begin until the 19th century. By the latter part of that century, European nations had claimed most of the African littoral, either directly or indirectly. However, much of the interior of Africa was still terra incognita to the Europeans and other Westerners. That situation began to change with the explorations of Sir Richard Francis Burton, John Hanning Speke, and Henry Morton Stanley. The latter, a Welsh-born American journalist, became world famous for his finding of the famed missionary explorer David Livingstone in 1872. Meanwhile, Livingstone's three C's, Christianity, civilization, and commerce, became Europe's justification for its imperial endeavors in Africa. The small nation of Belgium had few African connections, and most Belgians had little interest in that continent. The exception was Leopold II, who became their king in 1865. Leopold desired a larger world stage than his nation provided, and establishing an overseas empire appealed to him. Sub-Saharan Africa was a logical focus, but he disguised his imperial ambition under the cloak of humanitarianism. In 1876, he sponsored a geographical conference in Brussels, the capital of Belgium, attended by a number of notable explorers, with the exception of Henry Morton Stanley, who, then crossing Africa from its east to its west coast, under Leopold's leadership, the conference participants created the International African Association, or as it was also referred to as the Association Internationale Africaine AIA, with King Leopold as its first chairman. The association adopted a flag with a goldfish on a blue background. Meanwhile, in August 1877, Stanley completed the crossing of the African continent, thereby becoming the first explorer to chart much of the Congo River to its mouth. Eager to capitalize on Stanley's fame, King Leopold signed him to a 5-year contract to continue his explorations and to secure land concession in the Congo basin by making treaties with the African rulers. To Stanley and others, Leopold's interest in Africa appeared to be merely humanitarian. The ambitious king reconstituted his International African Association as the Association Internationale du Congo (AIC), or to some historians they said it was referred to as the International Congo Association, whose sphere of interest encompassed not only the region close to the Congo River but also the entire Congo Basin. Thanks to Stanley's work, the association's flag was flying over a number of small settlements along the Great River by the year 1884. As Leopold developed his own private colony in the heart of Africa, other issues were threatening the African status quo. The desire for raw materials and new markets, a consequence of the Industrial Revolution, had quickened European interest in Africa. Portugal, which had had a long presence in sub-Saharan Africa, began fearing French ambitions in the region, so it opened negotiations with Great Britain in 1882 that would give Britain an unofficial protectorate over the Congo in exchange for British recognition of Portugal's own territory claim along Africa's western coast. The British government was not eager to colonize the Congo, but it was adamant in defending the policy of free trade for its subjects, something that France was less likely to grant. In reaction to the proposed Anglo-Portuguese treaty, France and Germany, which had recently been opponents in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871, increased their mutual diplomatic contacts because both opposed Britain's expanding its interest in Africa. Germany unified only since 1871 in what was known historically as the German Unification. Germany entered the colonial race late. Bismarck's personal enthusiasm for a German overseas empire was muted, but he was in the midst of a conflict with Britain over an inconsequential strip of territory in southwest Africa, a dispute that had escalated when the British government failed to immediately respond to Bismarck's concern. France had its own ambition, notably the establishment of French colonial authority along the Niger River, north of the Congo. In October 1884, with French support, Bismarck issued invitation to a conference to meet in Germany's capital, Berlin, in November. Unsure about the aims of the conference, the British were initially reluctant to participate and demanded guarantees of free trade and navigation along both the Niger and Congo rivers. The initial stages of the conference dealt with the issue of freedom of commerce in the Congo basin and at the mouth of the Congo River. The second stage dealt with freedom of navigation along the Congo and Niger rivers, and the last stage in February 1885 considered the issue of what became known as effective occupation of territory by colonial powers. Humanitarian concerns, including the abolishment of the slave trade, played little part in the conference discussions, despite earlier intimations of the contrary. Negotiations among the principal powers resulted in the creation of an extensive Congo state under the aegis of Leopold's International Congo Association, while France and Portugal were awarded limited adjacent territories, territories that did not seriously impinge upon Leopold's vision and ambitions. A broader issue considered by the conference was that of effective colonial occupation. As established colonial powers, Britain and France favored a loose definition of effective occupation, while Germany, which was initially not an imperial power, wanted to require would-be colonial powers to demonstrate effective political control over territories before claiming the territories as their colonies. After much discussions and compromise, the conferees agreed that any new colonial claim along the African coast required that the occupying state notify the other signatory states. In addition, when and if new colonies were claimed and established, existing rights must be respected and freedom of trade be guaranteed. In spite of what is often claimed about the Berlin Conference, Africa was not formally partitioned as a result of the Berlin Conference. The so-called scramble for Africa had begun earlier, and by the early 20th century, only Ethiopia, Liberia, and Morocco remained free from direct European control. Nevertheless, there were some clear winners at the conference. For example, Britain used the conference to prevent its rival France from occupying the Congo Basin, although the German-French entente broke down over various issues. It succeeded in forcing Britain, which had recently occupied Egypt, to accept international regulation of both the Suez Canal and the Egyptian government's debt. During the period leading up to the conference, Germany acquired several colonies in Africa and elsewhere, but it was the King of Belgians, Leopold II, who emerged truly victorious. Diplomatic recognition of his International Congo Association resulted in international recognition of the sovereignty of his Congo Free State, a territory in the heart of Africa that was larger than Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Belgium combined. In fact, Congo is the second largest state in Africa by landmass after Algeria. Now, the ultimate losers were Africa's native people, especially the Congo, or the Congolese. The Congo Free State regime soon became one of the most rapacious and inhuman regimes on the continent, and under its banner, slavery and other forms of human degradation became the norm of the quest for economic profits. In 1908, the Belgian government took the colony away from Leopold's control. At the time, only the coastal areas of Africa were colonized by the European powers. At the Berlin Conference, the European colonial powers scrambled to gain control over the interior of the continent, The conference lasted until February 26, 1885, a 3-month period where colonial powers haggled over geometric boundaries in the interior of the continent, degrading the cultural and linguistic boundaries already established by the indigenous African population. Following the Berlin Conference, the give and take continued. By 1914, the conference participants had fully divided Africa among themselves into 50 countries. Major colonial holdings included the following: Great Britain desired Cape to Cairo collection of colonies and almost succeeded through their control of Egypt, Sudan, in what became known as the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, British East Africa, South Africa, Zambia, Zimbabwe, which were the Rhodesians, and Botswana. The British also controlled Nigeria and Ghana, which was known as Gold Coast from the west. France took much of Western Africa, from Mauritania to Chad, French West Africa, as well as Gabon and the Republic of Congo, French Equatorial Africa. Belgium and King Leopold II controlled the Democratic Republic of Congo, Belgian Congo. Portugal took Mozambique in the east and Angola in the west. Italy's holdings were Somalia, Italian Somaliland, and portion of Ethiopia, even though they could not penetrate fully into the territory of Ethiopia during the time when Menelik II was king and resisted Italian conquest by involving them in what was known popularly as the guerrilla warfare. Germany took Namibia, German Southwest Africa, and Tanganyika, which became Tanzania, German East Africa. Spain claimed the smallest territory, which was Equatorial Guinea, Rio Muni. The General Act of the Conference of Berlin, the official agreement signed at the end of the conference, contained 6 declarations. It held the Congo River Basin to be neutral, a fact that in no way deterred the Allies from extending the war into the area in World War I, guaranteed freedom for trade and shipping for all states in the basin, forbade slave trading, provided for free navigation of the Congo River, provided for free navigation of the Niger River, and established a framework for recognizing any new occupation of African coastal territory by European powers. Thus, the European scramble for Africa territory had already begun years earlier. The pace of colonization greatly accelerated after the conference. One may begin to wonder, what are the echoes that still remain as a result of this conference? The conference ended in 1885. The ink dried. The men returned home to Europe. But Africa did not return to what it was. The borders they drew still stand, cutting through languages, families, and histories. The violence they enabled did not end with colonization. It evolved, echoed, and lingered. From the forest of the Congo to the desert of the Sahel, the consequences of that room in Berlin are still felt, in conflict, in struggle, and in the search for identity. The Berlin Conference was not merely a moment in history, it was a turning point, one where power spoke louder than people, and silence cost millions their future. To remember, it is not to dwell on the past, but to understand the present, because history does not disappear. It waits, it echoes, and until those echoes are understood, they will continue to reshape the world we live in today. Thank you all for listening.